What do you think an old man like me can do with a rifle? Sergeant Carson scoffed, his voice dripping with the arrogance of youth. The sound of his boots crunching on the gravel echoed in the quiet air of the Delta Force training ground. His eyes locked on the elderly figure sitting on the edge of the firing line, wiping down a weathered rifle with slow, deliberate strokes. The old man barely looked up, the silence between them stretching like a taut wire ready to snap. "I'll tell you what, old man," Carson continued, walking closer. "This ain't a place for fossils. Maybe you should go home and put that thing on a shelf somewhere." His words cut through the air, thick with disdain. Jack Mitchell, the old veteran, sat motionless. His hands, worn by age and battle, continued their steady work on the rifle as if Carson's insults were nothing more than a distant echo. "You think that old relic still has value?" Carson sneered. "You're out of your league here, Grandpa." The words barely left his mouth before the old man's hand paused, fingers tracing the barrel of the rifle. Carson was about to speak again, but something in the veteran's demeanor stopped him. Jack Mitchell's blue eyes, though clouded with age, were sharp, piercing through the thick veil of arrogance Carson wore like a mask. The rifle, a relic of the past, gleamed under the harsh sunlight, but it wasn't the rifle that commanded attention. It was the old man himself, the silence around him pressing down on the young soldier like an invisible weight. "You've never known what it's like to be in the real fight," Carson muttered, a hint of uncertainty creeping into his voice. But Jack didn't flinch. He didn't move. He didn't need to. "It's not about the rifle," Jack Mitchell said, his voice low but steady, like a distant thunderstorm. "It's about what it's been through. What I've been through." Carson didn't know what to say. His eyes flicked to the rifle, then to the worn, battle-scarred hands that held it. For a brief moment, he saw something there, something beyond the surface, something that made him feel small. The rifle wasn't just a weapon. It was a symbol of survival, of battles fought and won in the most unforgiving corners of the world. And as Carson's gaze shifted, he saw something else, a small engraving on the side of the rifle, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. His heart skipped a beat. He leaned in, his fingers brushing against the engraving. The faintest tremor ran through him. "What is that?" Carson asked, his voice barely a whisper. Jack Mitchell didn't answer. He didn't need to. The engraving said it all, a call sign, a name that carried with it the weight of legends, a name that sent chills down Carson's spine. "Titan 3, he read aloud. The room seemed to freeze. The air grew heavy, the sound of the wind and the distant hum of the training ground fading away. In that instant, the young soldier realized the truth. Jack Mitchell wasn't just any old veteran. He was a legend. The stories of battles, of saving lives, of commanding respect from men far younger and far more powerful than Carson could ever imagine, were written into the very fabric of the rifle he held in his hands. Sergeant Carson straightened up, a wave of realization washing over him. He looked at Jack Mitchell, the quiet old man who had remained stoic through every insult, now standing as a monument to a forgotten era of warriors. And for the first time, Sergeant Carson felt the weight of respect, true, unshakable respect, settle in his chest. The old man had been right. It wasn't the rifle that mattered. It was the man who held it. And now, in the presence of that legend, Sergeant Carson stood frozen, a soldier humbled by the silence of history. The tension in the air was thick now, as Sergeant Carson stood frozen in place, his fingers still resting on the engraved call sign. Titan 3. The words echoed in his mind, like a whisper from the past that refused to fade away. He looked at Jack Mitchell, whose face remained unchanged, eyes fixed on the horizon as if the entire scene before them was of no consequence. Carson's heart was still racing, his mind struggling to process the weight of what he had just uncovered. He had heard stories about legendary veterans, of course. Everyone had. But he had never imagined standing in front of one, let alone insulting him with the kind of arrogance that now seemed almost unforgivable. He cleared his throat, trying to regain some control over his voice. You were Titan 3? Jack Mitchell's gaze shifted slightly, just enough to meet his eyes, but he didn't speak. It wasn't necessary. The way he stood, calm and composed, said everything. The silence stretched between them, but this time, it wasn't uncomfortable, it was powerful. Carson finally stepped back, his hand dropping from the rifle. He felt small. The bravado he had carried so confidently into this interaction had dissolved. And in its place, there was nothing but respect, silent, undeniable respect. It wasn't just the call sign that made Carson stop in his tracks. It was the realization that the man standing before him had lived through things he could only imagine. Things that had shaped him into someone whose presence commanded respect. And in that moment, Sergeant Carson understood something he never had before. This old veteran wasn't just some relic of a bygone era. He was a hero. A real one. Jack Mitchell, Titan III, had seen things that would break most men. He had survived battles, missions, and moments that Carson could never fathom. And yet here he was, sitting quietly, as if the world hadn't forgotten the legacy he carried with him. Carson's mind wandered briefly, trying to imagine the stories Mitchell could tell. The life he had lived, the people he had saved, the countless sacrifices made. And yet, here he was, no fanfare, no attention, just a man cleaning his rifle like it was any other day. Carson's eyes wandered back to the engraving. The simple letters that told a story without uttering a single word. His fingers itched to ask more, to learn more, but the words seemed unnecessary now. What could he possibly say that would honor a man like this? He wasn't sure if he even deserved to know the full story. "You don't talk much, do you?" Carson asked quietly, more to himself than to Mitchell. The old man's eyes shifted again, this time with a hint of understanding. "There's nothing left to say," Jack Mitchell finally replied, his voice low but steady. "The past speaks for itself." Carson nodded slowly, unsure of what else to do. The weight of those words settled in his chest. He had been so quick to judge, to mock, to dismiss. But now, all he could do was stand there, humbled by the presence of a man who had earned the right to silence. And in that silence, Sergeant Carson realized that sometimes the greatest stories were never told. They were simply lived. Jack Mitchell stood up slowly, the weight of his years pressing on him. But there was a grace in every movement. He gathered his rifle, slinging it over his shoulder with the ease of someone who had done it thousands of times before. And with one last glance at Carson, he turned and began to walk away. Carson stood there for a long moment, staring at the old man's retreating figure, feeling the humbling weight of history on his shoulders. Titan III. The legend wasn't just a man from the past. He was standing in front of him, showing him what true strength looked like, not in the form of muscles or medals, but in the quiet dignity of a life well lived. Sergeant Carson stood there for a while, watching as Jack Mitchell walked away, his figure slowly fading into the distance. The quiet stillness of the training ground felt different now, heavier, more profound. It was as if the air itself had shifted, carrying the weight of a history that Carson had never truly understood until now. His eyes lingered on the place where the old man had stood, and for the first time, Carson could almost feel the presence of all those who had come before him. He felt small, not in a physical sense, but in the vastness of time and experience that Mitchell had lived through. For the first time, Carson questioned the meaning of his own actions. Was his confidence just a shield to cover up the gaps in his understanding? Or had he truly been as foolish as he felt now? He turned around, looking back at the rest of his team, still engaged in their drills, oblivious to the quiet moment that had just unfolded. They were all so wrapped up in the business of training, of proving themselves in the heat of competition, but Carson knew there was something far more important here, a lesson he had just begun to learn. As he walked toward the group, he couldn't shake the feeling that the respect he thought he commanded was nothing more than a thin veneer. Mitchell's silence had said more than any battle or command ever could. Carson's footsteps slowed as he approached, his mind still racing with the realization. The old man wasn't just a relic from the past. He was a living testament to what real service, sacrifice, and courage looked like. Carson took a deep breath, shaking off the lingering sense of humility that seemed to cloud his mind. He had a job to do, but it wasn't the same job he had thought he was here to do. This wasn't about outshining the others or proving his worth in front of his peers. It was about understanding the legacy he was part of. It was about earning respect, not demanding it. As he reached his fellow soldiers, one of them, Private Jenkins, looked up, noticing the shift in Carson's demeanor. "You all right, Sergeant?" Jenkins asked, his voice filled with the usual cockiness of youth. Carson didn't immediately respond. He just nodded, his eyes still distant. "Yeah," he said quietly, "I'm all right." The words felt hollow, but Carson knew he had a lot of work ahead of him. The challenge now was different. It wasn't about military drills or strategy. It wasn't about being faster, stronger, or better than anyone else. It was about something deeper, something quieter, honor, dignity, and the ability to listen. He glanced one last time at the horizon where Mitchell had disappeared. The old man had given him a glimpse into something far greater than any combat training could offer. And now, Sergeant Carson knew that his path wasn't just about leading men in battle. It was about becoming someone worthy of the respect he had just learned to give. Carson turned back to his team, his posture straighter than it had been when he first arrived. His gaze sharper, focused on something beyond the immediate tasks at hand. The rest of the day went by in a blur, but every movement, every decision felt different. It was as if he were seeing the world through new eyes. Eyes that understood the value of silence, of waiting, of respecting what had come before. That evening, as Carson sat alone, cleaning his rifle, he thought back to what Mitchell had said. The past speaks for itself. Those words echoed in his mind as he wiped down the cold metal of his weapon. The rifle in his hands was no longer just a tool of war. It was a symbol of all the men and women who had carried it before him. The ones who had fought, bled, and sacrificed so that he could stand here today. And now, as he placed the rifle back in its case, Carson understood that it wasn't just about the fight. It was about the honor of those who fought before him and those who would come after. The next few days passed slowly, each one stretching longer than the last as Sergeant Carson mulled over what he had learned from Jack Mitchell. The usual rhythm of training, of drills, of daily life on the base, all seemed to fade into the background. Carson found himself thinking more and more about the man he had once looked down upon, and what it meant to be part of something greater than himself. Every time he saw his fellow soldiers, joking, laughing, pushing themselves to be the best, it felt different. It wasn't that he had grown disillusioned with the mission or with his team. It was that he was starting to see things differently. There was more to it than just the uniforms, the weapons, and the rank. There was a deeper meaning to their work, a history behind each action, and a responsibility to honor those who had paved the way before them. As Carson sat in the mess hall that evening, surrounded by his peers, his mind wandered again. His eyes kept flicking toward the corner where Jack Mitchell had sat those days ago, cleaning his rifle as if it were just another task, another moment in time. There was a quiet dignity in the way Mitchell moved, the way he carried himself, unfazed by the attention, or lack thereof, from the younger soldiers around him. Carson's hand paused midair, his spoon hovering above his bowl. The other soldiers around him continued to chat, completely unaware of the shift that had taken place in him. He had always been quick to rise through the ranks, pushing himself harder than anyone else, but now it felt like he was missing something. He wasn't the only one who had been through hardship or sacrifice. There were countless others who had walked the same paths, their stories hidden beneath the surface, waiting to be acknowledged. The older soldiers had their own wisdom, their own experiences, and they didn't always flaunt them. He wondered how many of them carried stories like Mitchell's, silent heroes who had lived through things that could never be captured in a medal or a ceremony. Carson's thoughts were interrupted by the loud voice of Private Jenkins, his usual source of levity. "Hey, Sergeant, you're staring off into space again. You all right?" The rest of the table turned to look at him, and Carson quickly snapped out of his reverie. He forced a smile and nodded. "Yeah, just thinking." "Thinking about what?" Jenkins asked, leaning forward, clearly interested in getting a rise out of him. "Nothing that's gonna make any sense," Carson replied, his smile fading slightly. Jenkins gave him a puzzled look, but didn't press any further. Instead, he turned back to the rest of the group and continued his usual banter. Carson sat back in his chair, his eyes scanning the faces around him. These were his teammates, his brothers in arms. They had all been through so much together. And yet, despite all their shared experiences, there was something Carson hadn't seen until now. They were all so focused on the next step, the next challenge, the next win. But what about the things they had already accomplished? What about the moments of quiet strength, like the one Jack Mitchell had shown him? Carson knew that he couldn't just go through the motions anymore. He needed to step back and really see the people around him. He needed to understand that strength wasn't just about physical prowess or leadership in the heat of battle. It was about respect. Respect for the past, respect for the sacrifices that had been made, and respect for the quiet moments that defined a person's true character. That night, as he lay in his bunk, Carson thought about the day he would face the inevitable challenge again. He would have to lead, to prove himself in battle, to push himself beyond his limits. But this time, he would do it with a new understanding, a new perspective. He wouldn't just be fighting for victory. He would be fighting to honor the legacy of those who had come before him, like Jack Mitchell, who had taught him that the greatest victories are often those that go unseen, those that are carried in silence. Days passed, and the routine of training began to feel different to Sergeant Carson. The weight of his new understanding lingered in the back of his mind, constantly reminding him that there was more to being a soldier than strength and skill. It was the quiet moments that defined a man, the moments when the world was still and his actions spoke louder than any words could. As the sun rose on another training day, Carson found himself outside the barracks, staring out across the base. His thoughts drifted back to Jack Mitchell, to the lessons the old man had unknowingly imparted. Mitchell had shown him that true strength wasn't about dominating a battlefield or proving oneself in front of others. It was about humility, respect, and the ability to stand firm without boasting. Carson wasn't sure if Mitchell had meant to teach him anything at all, but that's what had happened. He had been so wrapped up in his own idea of what it meant to be a leader, to be the best, that he had overlooked what really mattered. Now, he could see things more clearly. As he walked to the training field, Carson couldn't help but notice the younger soldiers, still chasing after the same fleeting goals he had once sought. They were hungry for recognition, for validation, for the title of best. But Carson knew now that those things didn't matter. What truly mattered was earning the respect of those around you, not by force, but by example. He joined his team for morning drills, his presence no longer carrying the same sense of urgency or competition. Instead, he found himself taking a step back, allowing others to take the lead, while he observed. He watched how they interacted with each other, how they handled mistakes, and how they worked together to solve problems. It was in these moments that Carson realized that leadership wasn't just about giving orders. It was about knowing when to step forward and when to step back, knowing when to speak and when to listen. Carson's role in the group began to shift. He wasn't the loudest voice anymore. He wasn't the one to rush in with all the answers. Instead, he took a quieter approach, offering guidance only when needed, allowing others to rise to the occasion. And in doing so, he saw a change in his team. They responded differently to him now, not with the same hesitance they had shown before, but with a newfound respect. They recognized that he wasn't just a man who held a position of authority, but a man who understood the value of working together. The training became less about individual glory and more about the team. It wasn't about who could complete the drill, the fastest, or who could lift the heaviest weight. It was about working as one, relying on each other's strengths, and lifting each other up when needed. For the first time, Carson understood what it meant to be truly part of a team. It wasn't about winning alone, it was about winning together. The more he immersed himself in this new perspective, the more he felt at peace with his place among his comrades. He had spent so much of his life striving to be the best, to be the one who stood out. But now, he found comfort in knowing that sometimes, the best way to lead was to stand behind others, offering support when needed. That evening, as Carson sat by himself, he thought back to Jack Mitchell. The old man's quiet strength had left a mark on him, one that he couldn't shake. He realized that the true power of a soldier wasn't in how fast he could run or how many enemies he could defeat. It was in his ability to remain calm in the face of chaos, to carry the weight of his experiences with grace, and to lead by example without the need for recognition. Carson smiled to himself. The lessons he had learned from Mitchell weren't just about military tactics. They were about life itself. And as he prepared for another day of training, he knew that his journey had only just begun. Sergeant Carson woke up early the next morning, the cold air outside seeping through the cracks of the barracks windows. He had spent the night reflecting on everything that had happened since meeting Jack Mitchell. It was strange how one encounter had shifted his entire perspective. He had come into this world of training, of competition, thinking it was all about proving himself, about being the fastest, the strongest, the best. But now, after everything he had seen and learned, he realized it was about something more, something deeper, As he dressed and prepared for the day's drills, his thoughts wandered back to the quiet moments, to the lessons Mitchell had unknowingly taught him. Leadership, Carson had once believed, was about taking charge, about being the one to make the tough calls. But now, he understood that true leadership wasn't about being in control all the time. It was about knowing when to listen, when to step back, and when to allow others to step up. It was about trust. Trust in your team, and trust in yourself. The sound of boots hitting the floor echoed through the barracks as his team began to assemble outside for the morning exercise. Carson joined them, walking with purpose but a newfound calmness in his steps. He noticed the way his team looked at him now, not with the same skepticism they had before, but with something else, respect. Not because of anything he had done to earn it, but because he had shown them something more valuable than speed or power. He had shown them that leadership wasn't about making yourself the center of attention. It was about making those around you better. They began the day's drill with a simple exercise, running the obstacle course. As the team lined up, Carson felt a subtle shift in the air. He could see it in their eyes. They were ready. Ready to work together, not as individuals, but as a single unit. As the whistle blew, the team moved forward, working seamlessly, helping each other over walls, across bars, and through the tightest spaces. Carson found himself in the back of the pack for once, watching as his soldiers moved together in perfect synchronization. It was a far cry from the way things had started, when everyone had been focused on outdoing one another. Now, they were a team. They finished the course with time to spare, and the energy was different. There was a sense of accomplishment, not because they had beaten the clock, but because they had done it together. Carson felt a small smile tug at the corner of his mouth. This was what it was all about. Not the victory itself, but the way they had achieved it, side by side. As they gathered for a quick briefing afterward, Carson stood back, watching them interact. They were still competitive, still striving to be the best, but it was no longer the same cutthroat competition it had once been. They were pushing each other to be better, but with an understanding that it was the collective effort that mattered most. Carson couldn't help but think of Mitchell again. The old man had shown him that the true strength of a soldier wasn't just in the battles they fought, but in the way they carried themselves, in the way they led without needing to be in the spotlight. It wasn't about being the fastest or the strongest. It was about being the one who could keep their head when everything else was chaotic. The one who could lead by example, even in silence. As the day went on, Carson found himself more at ease. He had a long way to go before he truly understood the depth of what it meant to be a leader, but he was no longer in a rush to figure it out. The journey had become about the lessons learned along the way, and those were the ones that would shape him into the kind of man he wanted to be. A man like Mitchell, calm, steady, respected not for his rank, but for the way he carried himself, for the quiet strength that spoke louder than words ever could. The days continued to pass, and as Sergeant Carson adjusted to his new role, he found himself becoming more reflective. The lessons he had learned from Jack Mitchell were still fresh in his mind, and with each passing day, they sank deeper into his bones. It wasn't just about the drills, the exercises, or the tests of strength anymore. He began to see the bigger picture, the bond that connected all the soldiers, the respect they had for each other, and the humility that came with true leadership. Carson had always been quick to take charge, to lead from the front, but now he understood that leadership was not just about commanding others. It was about serving them, supporting them, and allowing them to shine. It was about lifting them up when they faltered and standing beside them when they needed it most. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling training session, Carson found himself alone in the mess hall, sitting at a table in the back corner. The room was filled with the usual chatter, the hum of conversation that seemed to echo off the walls. But Carson's thoughts were elsewhere. His eyes drifted across the room, and he saw his team, laughing together, talking about their plans for the weekend. He felt a sense of pride. They were no longer just soldiers under his command. They were a unit, a team that trusted one another and worked together, each playing their part. He had done something right. He had helped build something that mattered. But as he sat there, feeling the quiet hum of satisfaction, Carson's mind wandered back to Mitchell. The old man hadn't asked for anything. He hadn't expected admiration or respect. He had simply lived his life, quietly carrying the weight of his experiences. There was something profound in that, something Carson could barely put into words. the kind of strength that didn't need to be flaunted, the kind that spoke in silence. Carson had spent so much of his life chasing the idea of glory, of recognition. But now, he realized that the real glory lay not in being seen, but in making others feel seen. The more he reflected, the more he understood that the true test of a leader was not how they performed when all eyes were on them, but how they performed when no one was looking. He stood up from the table, the weight of his thoughts pressing down on him. His team was finishing their meal, and the conversations were winding down. Carson moved toward the door, his pace slow, thoughtful. He stepped outside, into the cool evening air, and found himself walking toward the training grounds. The base was quiet now, the bustle of the day replaced by a peaceful stillness. As he walked across the field, he found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. He thought about all the lessons he had learned, the ones that had come from his fellow soldiers, and the ones that had come from moments of solitude. He thought about Mitchell, the quiet veteran whose strength had been more powerful than any display of force. Carson wasn't sure where his journey would take him next. There were still so many lessons to learn, so many ways to grow. But he knew one thing for sure. He was no longer the same person he had been when he first arrived at the base. He was a different kind of leader now, one who understood the value of humility, of respect, and of the quiet moments that shaped a soldier's true character. As he reached the far end of the field, Carson paused and looked up at the sky. The stars were starting to appear, their faint light twinkling in the vastness of the night. He took a deep breath, feeling the cool air fill his lungs, and for the first time in a long while, he felt at peace. He wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was part of something bigger, a part of a legacy that had been built by those who had come before him, and one he would help carry forward. And in that quiet moment, Carson understood that true strength wasn't about being the best. It was about making the world better for those around you, about leading with integrity, and about honoring the legacy of those who had paved the way. It was a week later when Sergeant Carson found himself walking the base once again, his thoughts settled into a quiet rhythm. The lessons he had learned, the growth he had experienced, felt like a weight, but in the best way. It wasn't a burden to carry. It was a responsibility he had come to appreciate. He walked past the barracks, the hum of activity still buzzing in the air, the sound of soldiers training, the clatter of boots on the pavement, and the low murmur of conversations blended together, a constant reminder of the life he had chosen. It was a good life, but it was more than that now. Carson had come to realize that being a soldier was about more than just following orders. It was about making the right choices, understanding what it meant to lead, and, above all, respecting the journey of those who had come before. That afternoon, as Carson sat on the bench outside the training field, watching the sun dip lower in the sky, he thought about Mitchell again. The old man had never asked for anything, never demanded anything from anyone. He simply existed as a quiet force of nature. Carson smiled softly to himself. Mitchell had taught him that true strength wasn't about being the loudest voice in the room or the one who commanded attention. It was about knowing when to speak and when to remain silent, when to lead and when to follow. And above all, it was about carrying the weight of the past with grace, not as a burden, but as a badge of honor. Carson glanced around, his eyes landing on his team. They were still going through the drills, pushing themselves harder with each run. The competitive fire that had once driven Carson now felt like something distant, something that belonged to a younger version of himself. He stood up and walked toward them, his footsteps purposeful. As he joined his team, he noticed that the atmosphere had changed. It wasn't just about winning anymore. It wasn't about who could finish first or who could perform the best. It was about making each other better. It was about trusting one another to give their best, not just for the team, but for themselves. Carson fell in step with them, not leading, but moving alongside them. It was a subtle shift, but one that felt profound. The group had grown in ways that Carson hadn't anticipated. They weren't just soldiers training for the next mission. They were a family, bound together by a sense of purpose, by a shared understanding that they weren't in this alone. As they finished the drill and gathered together for a brief discussion, Carson saw the change in them. Their eyes met his, not with the same need for validation that had been there before, but with quiet respect. They were ready to face whatever came next, not as individuals, but as a unit. And in that moment, Carson felt something deep within him shift again. He was no longer just a soldier. He was part of something greater, something that could never be measured in medals or recognition. He had found his place, not at the front, but within the heart of the team. It was a different kind of leadership, one that required patience, humility, and an understanding that sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is stay silent and trust the strength of those around them. As the evening sky darkened and the stars began to appear, Carson stood quietly with his team, the warmth of their camaraderie surrounding him. For the first time in a long while, he felt at peace. The journey was far from over, but he was ready for whatever came next. Because now, he understood something important. The true strength of a soldier wasn't in the battles they fought, but in the bonds they formed along the way. The morning arrived with the usual crispness, but there was a quiet shift in the air. Sergeant Carson stood outside the barracks, the early sun casting long shadows across the ground. He had become accustomed to the routine, the steady pace of life on base, but today felt different. It wasn't just another day of drills and exercises. It felt like a day of transition. A day where everything he had learned, everything he had become, would come to a head. As he walked toward the training field, his thoughts drifted once more to Jack Mitchell. The old veteran had unknowingly set him on this path, but now, Carson felt ready to walk it on his own. He wasn't the same man who had arrived at the base all those months ago, eager to prove himself through strength and speed. He had found a new purpose, one that wasn't about being the best, but about understanding the value of those around him. He joined his team for the morning briefing, his eyes scanning the faces of the soldiers. They were different now, too. The sense of unity among them had grown, a shared understanding that they weren't just individual pieces in a larger machine. They were a team. Carson felt a deep sense of pride in them, in how far they had come. It wasn't about how fast they could complete a drill or how flawlessly they could execute orders. It was about the trust they had in one another, the respect they had earned, not through words or titles, but through their actions. The whistle blew, signaling the start of the day's exercises. As the team moved into position, Carson found himself not at the front, but among them. For once, he wasn't leading from the front. He was leading by example, stepping back to allow others to rise. It was a subtle shift, but a meaningful one. As they went through the drills, Carson watched how each soldier took on their role, pushing themselves, but also pushing each other. They weren't just looking to outdo one another anymore. They were working together, lifting each other up, becoming stronger as a unit. Carson felt a deep sense of fulfillment as they completed the exercises with precision and coordination. There was no talk of personal glory, no sense of competition, just the quiet satisfaction of a job well done, together. After the drill, they gathered for a debrief. Carson stood at the back, listening as his team discussed what went well and what needed improvement. It was a far cry from the days when they would have been shouting over each other, each soldier trying to make their voice heard above the rest. Now, they listened. They respected each other's opinions. Carson knew they were ready to face whatever came next. He couldn't help but think back to those early days, when he had felt the pressure to prove himself, to be the one who stood out. Now, he realized that true leadership wasn't about standing out. It was about standing together. The team wasn't just a group of individuals. They were a collective force, a family. And as he looked at them, he knew that this was the kind of team he had always wanted to be a part of. The kind that wasn't defined by individual accomplishments, but by the strength of their bonds. The sun was setting as the day came to a close, casting the field in a warm, golden light. Carson stood alone for a moment, looking out over the horizon. He had come a long way from the soldier who had first arrived at the base, unsure of what he was truly seeking. Now he knew. It wasn't glory. It wasn't recognition. It was the quiet strength that came from working with those around him, from lifting each other up, from respecting the journey they all shared. And as he stood there, watching the last rays of the sun dip below the horizon, he felt a deep sense of peace. This was what it meant to be part of something greater. This was what it meant to lead.